We've confirmed 5 circuit nominees, and with this one will be the 27th district judge confirmed. I'll put the balance of my statement in the record.
President, I'd ask consent to
Senator from Vermont.
speak for 1 minute.
Without objection. Is there an objection?
I'd like to have a minute then, too.
You have a minute. I have no objection to the senator from. In fact, I'll give the courtesy to the senator from Iowa that he did not give to me, and I'd be happy to yield in the 1 minute. Usually, Mr. President.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Usually, Mr. President, it's been my experience in 37 years in this Senate, as the second most senior member here, if a senator wants to come and attack another senator, they have the courtesy of giving him notice before they do. I'm sorry my friend from Iowa didn't follow the normal courtesy. I withhold the balance of my time.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
For my 1 minute, I'll respond to that simply by saying this, that I'm talking about the institutions of the United States Senate and not one single senator personally. I yield the floor, back the balance of my time, and put the balance of my statement in the record.
Mr. President, how much time do I have remaining?
The senator has 45 seconds.
Mr. President, I yield to no member of this body in the fact that I uphold not only the rules but the courtesies of this Senate. As chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I have never cut off a member of the other party who wished to speak, unlike some of the procedures that they followed when they held the chair. I have never refused to have a member of the other party bring up an amendment contrary to the procedures they followed when they chaired it. Mr. President, I believe in the Senate. I believe in the rules of the Senate, but especially I believe in the comity that Thomas Jefferson believed in this body. Otherwise, the Senate falls apart. I yield back the balance of the time.
Question is on the nomination. Yeas and nays have been called. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders.
I'm going to break my heart, Joe Manchin.
Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Chester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Alexander, Barrasso, Bennett, Bingaman, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Carper, Coburn, Conrad, Coons, Cornyn, Enzi, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Heller, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Kyle, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Lugar, Manchin, McCain, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murkowski, Nelson of Nebraska, Pryor, Roberts, Sanders, Tester, Thune, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Warner, Webb. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Cochran, Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Coates, Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Sessions, Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Carey, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Brown of Ohio, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Inouye, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Ms. Snow, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or to change their vote? On this vote, the ayes are 91, the nays are 1. The motion, the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President,
The senator from North Dakota.
I ask further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I thank the presiding officer and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The senator from North Dakota.
I ask further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I understand there are two bills at the desk due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bills for the second time.
S-3414, a bill to enhance the security and resiliency of the cyber and communications infrastructure of the United States. H.R. 5872, an act to require the President to provide a report detailing the sequester required by the Budget Control Act of 2011 on January 2, 2013.
On behalf of the leader, I'd object to any further proceedings with respect to these bills en bloc.
Objection having been heard, the bills will be placed on the calendar.
Madam President, I understand there is a bill at the desk, and I ask for its first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
S-3420, a bill to permanently extend the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts and so forth and for other purposes.
I now ask for a second reading, and in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provision of Rule 14, I object to my own request.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be read for a second time on the next legislative day.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the appointments at the desk appear separately in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, July 24th, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, and the time of the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, that the majority leader be recognized, and that the first hour be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half and the Republicans controlling the final half. Further, that the Senate recess from 12:30 until 2:15 to allow for the weekly conference meetings. And finally, that at 3:40 p.m. the Senate observe a moment of silence in memory of Officer Jacob J. Chestnut and Detective John M. Gibson of the United States Capitol Police, who were killed 14 years ago in the line of duty defending this Capitol, the people who work here, and its visitors against an armed intruder.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair. Today, the Majority Leader filed cloture on the motion to proceed to S-3412, the Middle Class Tax Cut Act. If no agreement is reached, that vote will be on Wednesday. If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Thank you.
The Senate has gavelled out on their agenda today consideration of Michael Shipp to be a federal district